Welcome everybody. It's 1 minute after 6 o'clock in the evening in Tallinn. We can start with our webinar on global energy futures. And in this webinar, we are taking a long view about 20 years ahead or so. And I emphasize the word futures because we're not going to discuss only one forecast or vision, how the global energy developments might or might not take place in the future, but we're looking at alternative scenarios and going to discuss these scenarios and implications of these scenarios. And those of you who are familiar with sort of global energy issues, it may not come as a surprise because in this field, there has been a long tradition to consider alternative scenarios and to use scenario planning rather than use one vision or forecast. I mean, scenario planning as a method is also called Shell method. It comes from Royal Dutch Shell. This is because Royal Dutch Shell was one of the companies who started to use this method a long time ago. For instance, it's well known that they had also one scenario already in the 70s about the potential collapse of the Soviet Union and what that might mean for the global energy market. So we're going to follow this tradition. And obviously, another reason why we are considering a number of different scenarios is because this is the field characterized by complexity and uncertainty. That was so even before the current coronavirus crisis and current economic crisis, and that obviously has added additional layers of uncertainty and complexity. So I have a great panelists here, all distinguished experts in the field. I will just say a few words of introduction about each panelist, and then we can start with our presentations. Our first presenter will be Anna Evers-Brugel, who's an economist at the Tetra Tech company in Washington, D.C. She's also a fellow at University of Texas, Austin. She has worked for the U.S. Department of Energy, has also done postgraduate work at the University of Maryland College Park and also University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. She received her PhD from sunny Syracuse in the US and has an MA in economics from University of Constance. Then I'm also joined by Dr. Van Day from University of California, Berkeley, where she is heading an institute that focuses on climate change and particularly sort of California and China. And this is particularly important because, China, there is no question about that, why we should consider and pay attention to China in the global energy developments. California, if it would be a separate entity, would probably would be one of the largest economies in the world. And California is often also sort of standard setter in the US concerning carbon emissions and so on. So often it is a race to the bottom, a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom in the US context. So, Fan also has degrees in both law from UC Berkeley and also a PhD in economics from New York. So welcome. We have also Professor Dr. Franziska Holz joining us from the German Institute of Economic Research, where she's heading, she's a deputy head of the Department for Energy, Transport and Environment. She's also a professor at the Norwegian University of Technology in Trondheim. She has also been teaching at the Hertie School in Berlin. So, and has published widely on this topic. So Franziska, welcome. Welcome to our webinar. And our last speaker will be Nicholas Trickett, who's joining us from a Wood Mackenzie, which is energy consultancy. Nick is joining us from London. He has a graduate degrees from London School of Economics, but also from the European University in St. Petersburg, Russia. And she has been paying close attention to political economy, particularly political economy of sort of Eurasian energy markets, because political decisions, politics of energy is very, very, very crucial as well, in addition to economic and sort of legal aspects. And I would like to welcome you, Nicholas, to our webinar. Thanks for joining us. So without further ado, I would like to give a screen to Anna, that she can show her slides and talk about the work she has been doing in the last couple of months for Foresight Center at the Estonian Parliament, where we have a project on global balance of power. And in this project, we are also particularly interested in what potential futures might be for the global energy development, in addition to some other topics we cover, such as digitalization. So please, Anna, thank you. Thanks for joining us. And here is an opportunity for you to present some of the energy scenarios in the post-COVID-19 world. Please, screen is yours.
Thank you, Melis. I have shared my screen. I assume that all of you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it very well. Thank you. Yeah.
I appreciate everyone who has dialed in. We're going to discuss an interesting topic and take an unorthodox view, the long view on post-COVID-19 world. Melis was very kind to introducing me. However, he forgot to mention perhaps the most important accomplishment. I was actually born and raised in Estonia, and my undergraduate degrees from the University of Tartu. So I was given this interesting task of reviewing over 60 different scenarios developed by different organizations and trying to make sense of it. So this presentation is going to provide a framework of understanding what types of possible energy futures we're facing and how post-COVID world might look like. And since I'm also a behavioral economist, I developed 4 scenarios in a 2x2 matrix that are really easy and clear to understand. So as we know that making predictions about is difficult, especially if these predictions are about the future. So I have approached this task with a certain degree of humility. What we need to know about scenario planning is that there are 3 broad categories where scenario planning, or you can hear energy outlooks and energy forecasting fall under. So today's presentation will be following the scenario planning, more narrative-based qualitative approach. As Melis has mentioned, has been introduced by Shell, there are certain advantages of this scenario because it explores plausible alternatives within a scenario cone that captures most possible futures. However, it doesn't constrain us to more mechanistic view of the world and allows creation of different futures that go beyond current understanding, such as the solution of Soviet Union that Melis also mentioned that wasn't thought of as a plausible scenario, but it happened. Scenario planning is now becoming more and more popular among policymakers. I'd like to draw your attention to an initiative started by IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, that brought together 11 countries and 7 international think tanks. And it's the first year of them working together on long-term energy scenarios. So my prediction for the future is that scenario planning will become increasingly popular among policymakers because it creates the framework of understanding uncertainty. As an economist, I also have a keen appreciation for modeling the future, employing quantitative, very complex energy models that have the aim of predicting the future to the highest possible degree of precision. So these are mostly mathematical models that describe demand and supply in the economy, trends in the market that also provide very important insights. And there's a third type of scenario that are basically backcasting. They set a future target. It could be 100% renewables. It could be a certain level of emissions. And then see what actions do we have to take now in order to get to where we want to be in the future. So again, today we're talking about scenario planning. Scenario planning is a busy space. Here you can see logos of different energy companies and international organizations, consultancies, as well as think tanks and NGOs that have developed different views of the future. You will see some very well-known names. However, I would like to also draw your attention to one of the strengths of the approach that we have employed for this study. Namely, we have looked beyond the Western scenario planning world and incorporated several views from beyond the usual English-speaking world. And I'd like to highlight Capsork of Saudi Arabia, Skolkovo of Russia, WWF Japan scenario, and scenarios developed by the Nordic West Office in the Nordic countries. So we hope that this provides a good overview of what people in all over the world are thinking about our energy futures. They're reading different scenarios. It became clear that they're obviously based on assumptions, and they're very good overviews of and critiques of different assumptions of these scenarios. Professor Holtz has recently published, together with Dawood Ansari, a paper in EEEP reviewing some of these assumptions. And I'm not going to repeat all of that. I'm going to just reference her paper and hope you will all go and read that. I really enjoyed reading it. However, it became clear that there were two types of drivers that most scenarios integrate in order to predict the future. So they look at the future through the lens of technology and policy. So a usual way of proceeding in scenario would be to define the pace of technological change. Say, is it an incremental technological improvement, like an evolution, or are we talking about a huge technological breakthrough? The same about policies. Most scenarios were looking at current policies that include current announcements, say commitments for 2040. And some of them were thinking about additional climate and energy policies that could be implemented, and where would it take us? So the main insights, unfortunately, very sobering insight, is that we're not meeting Paris targets by far. We are not going to keep our world, according to the models, well beyond below 2 degrees warming. So this is the bad news that we don't hear about in the news all the time, but it showed that there were only the most ambitious scenarios were getting us somewhere close to 2 degrees. We're not even talking about 1.5 degrees warming. So that creates the need and the understanding of the need for action. So all of the scenarios agree that energy transition is happening. However, they disagreed on the speed of this transition and which technologies will be the ones that are mostly used. For example, renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency are mentioned in all scenarios. Most scenarios mention high degree of electrification. However, knowing that we're not going to get to our Paris targets, I would like to highlight the importance of negative carbon technologies such as carbon capture and storage. At the moment, they seem to be luxury goods. However, in the future, we can argue that in order to keep the planet from warming, these could be go-to technologies, because they're the only ones that enable us to go to the scenario where we're actually keeping our warming below a certain level. There are other things that scenarios are predicting. For example, when the peak coal or peak oil is going to be reached. And this is a screen grab from a report by Skolkovo, and I added this because it also includes the Russian perspective, in addition to all the usual suspects of BP, IEA, and Shell scenarios, and so on. You can see there's quite a lot of difference in opinions about when the peak coal or peak oil is going to happen. A lot of these scenarios predicted that is going to happen past 2040. At the same time, what we're hearing now is that coronavirus might have brought us closer to peak coal and peak oil. There's some predictions that are saying that oil and coal demand are not going to recover anymore. So coronavirus fast forwarded us 20 years into the future. However, that wasn't a technological breakthrough or energy or changes in the energy market. This was a huge reduction in demand, so a demand shock. The same thing about high oil prices or low oil price scenarios. As you have heard in the news, the oil price has plummeted. So perhaps EAI for the next year need to develop a low oil price scenario. It is really sobering to see the numbers for electrification and electric mobility. These are very different from scenario to scenario. However, knowing that current electric vehicle market employs a very small market share, it's interesting to see that into the future, the predictions are really significant, starting from 15% to even 80%, as seen by IRENA, Global Energy Transformation Scenario. So how to summarize, how to create a framework of our thinking of what could our future be like? We started with developing 4 meta scenarios. There is a pessimistic one. We call it bad economy, hotter world. There are 2 scenarios that are driven by policies or driven by technologies. And then a certain innovation in scenario thinking is to include a wild card scenario, an unexpected scenario that is a little bit outside the usual of the middle of the scenario cone, where most of the plausible scenarios live. So this is an unlikely scenario. It's a positive scenario of a technological breakthrough. And I will talk more about that in the next slides. However, knowing what we know now, that negative scenario like a coronavirus could have such a huge impact on our energy systems that we should probably start thinking about integrating these unlikely scenarios into our thinking to be prepared. I've done a thorough review of energy scenarios, and the only organization I've found that considered a pandemic is FEMA, which is an American-based disaster relief agency. And this is their job to think about it, and it wasn't an energy scenario. And none of the scenarios of the 60 were looking at these extreme events that are happening. So let's go one by one. In the bad economy, hotter world scenarios, the worst predictions of coronavirus impacts are coming true. So the world is facing economic depression paired with inflation and really high structural unemployment. In face of all that, climate change action takes the back seat, and national governments are not really interested in climate negotiations, so they are breaking down. And the government role becomes more reacting rather than proactive, in the sense that economy is reeling and the decade of 2020 to 2030 is lost for energy transition. But we might also see first impacts of climate change if that time is lost, that would emerge by 2040 and beyond. And this might create social unrest and social tension, because it's likely that the impacts, the triple impacts of bad economy, health impacts from coronavirus, and impacts from climate change might be disproportionately falling on certain parts of population. So that might create social unrest. So this is the first scenario, the doom and gloom one. So here is the different view of the world. It could be market-driven energy transition. Here, entrepreneur emerges as front and center of driving that transition. And I can see some signs of that already now when you think about chairman of Tesla, or Jeff Bezos, or other entrepreneurs that are really changing the course of energy transition, their impacts might even increase their importance. So in that scenario, government still has a role, but it's a more supportive role. It stimulates energy research and development and makes sure that products are have fast commercialization. They simplify permitting, and this could be potentially more equal energy transition than the previous scenario, given that these innovations diffuse fast. At the same time, it might create some competition between countries that want to innovate faster, and perhaps replication of some successes of the Silicon Valley. So when we move to the next scenario, we start looking at big government solutions. And this scenario might emerge through and thanks to the epidemic that renewed the government mandate to take action in the best interest of the society. Since the government will be in charge, it might have the potential of redistributing the gains and losses from such an energy transition, creating a more equal world. At the same time, zooming out from the national level to the international stage, it might even create the climate race to the top. And it's not as unlikely as one might seem. I will give an example from the US. As you know, federal action on climate is non-existent in the US, but what we're hearing now is that subnational entities are start announcing 100% renewable or clean energy commitments by a certain date. So this race to the top can happen internationally if the economy recovers and the climate becomes big in the agenda. And the economic recovery could be actually driven by large energy infrastructure investments and other support for renewable energy. And quite a few countries are considering that at the moment. If you're following the news, you might have seen announcements from some EU countries. India, Canada, New Zealand are all considering green recovery. At the same time, this scenario might come at a cost of potential overregulation of energy markets and the government, big government picking the winners and losers, or have some negative impacts on individual freedoms that need to be considered. Now, this scenario does not emerge from a review of other scenarios. This scenario is a dark horse that introduces general purpose technology. And we have seen general purpose technologies changing the world before. It happened when the steam engine was invented, or electricity, or internet. The defining feature of general purpose technologies is that instead of having incremental impact on one system, these technologies have overarching impacts on many different systems, and energy system would be one of them. Research has shown that GPTs likely spur economic growth. So there is a bathtub effect. When there's more water right in the bathtub, then everybody's growing, everybody will be better off. And it spurs additional incremental innovation. Think about how much additional innovation internet has created. However, research has shown that it might need significant public leadership. Electrification didn't happen on its own. So even in this scenario, there's a pretty strong role of the government and governance that we can find. And it could be that this technology already exists. So pundits like OECD suggest that next GPT is artificial intelligence. So everybody, let's be on the lookout for new applications of AI to energy. How does COVID-19 fit in here? What we know now is that long-term impacts are really difficult to predict. And there's been a webinar that Melis hosted a couple of weeks ago that discussed different paths of recovery. It could be U-shaped or W-shaped. This is what most international CEOs think of, that recovery would be a U-shaped recovery. It could be a Nike swoosh, could be green recovery. it's difficult to predict what letter of the alphabet this recovery is going to look like. However, we know that there are certain markets that will be hit hard or harder than others by COVID-19. Here's a graph that has been just released by EAI in a couple of weeks ago. So you can see my cat joining the presentation. And you can see that all of these markets have really taken a big hit. Nuclear has taken a small hit, but renewables are the only markets that are at the moment growing. What we do know about coronavirus, that this is a really serious change in energy demand and world as we know it. So it's not as bad as the World War II, but it's nearing the level of decrease in energy demand during the Great Depression. And you can see compared to financial crisis of 2008 or first oil shock, coronavirus has already had a larger impact than these three. It could create renewed trust in the government, say create new mandate for climate action. And since the government needs to finance green recovery from somewhere, the likelihood of carbon tax has increased. And these are not my words, these are words of some energy pundits. Let's summarize all of the likelihoods of the scenarios. So with COVID-19, unfortunately, bad economy and hotter world scenario is more likely to happen if we are going to be in protracted recession. We might be losing valuable time. Innovation unleashed, in my opinion, is less likely due to coronavirus's impact on small businesses and innovation in general. However, big government solutions might be more likely due to public's renewed trust in government action and how the pandemic has been handled. And seeing that we are all in this together, as the hashtag goes. The effects on the dark horse scenario is ambiguous because on one hand, dark horse scenario does need innovators. On the other hand, it also needs the big government. However, as a summary, I'd like to say that the dark horse scenario might not be as unlikely as we think, because if it's paired with big government, dark horse can create unimaginable change. And it's like eating your cake and having it at the same time. We could have cleaner world, more technologically advanced world, and hopefully a world with positive growth when people are better off tomorrow. So if there is a way out of current situation, this could be one of them, and the governments should consider that. So I will finish my presentation and yield the screen back to Melis. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much, Anna, for this comprehensive overview of various alternative scenarios. If you have questions to Anna, you can actually post them in a Q&A section, and I already see one question there for you, Anna. We will come back to the questions in the end in our discussion section, but if you have time, meanwhile, you're obviously welcome to also write your answers there in the Q&A section. So without further ado, I would like to go to Dr. Van Dye from UC Berkeley, where she is heading the Climate Institute, and she will particularly look at two of the very important entities, China and California, in her presentation. So Van, you can share slides by share screen button in the Zoom, if you want to.
Great, thanks Melis, and thanks. It's always good to see you, Anna. Thanks for including me. I guess I'll start by a few words introducing myself. I'm actually a classmate with Anna. Those days in Syracuse, very good memories. So I'm heading as Melis introduced, I'm heading the California-China Climate Institute, which is based at Berkeley, UC Berkeley School of Law. I guess today we're almost 8:30 right now here. I would try to be very brief about some observations I would like to share with all of you in terms of COVID-19 and its impact on climate, energy, and of course, also my personal view of China's energy outlook through 2050. I'll try to share my screen and see where that. I don't know if you all can see the slide.
So, can you go to the presentation mode? Yeah. Okay, that works.
Okay, great.
Yeah, please.
So yeah, I would like to actually start with COVID-19 and
It seems, can everybody else hear me? It seems that we have lost Fan. There was a connection problem. Since we have a limited time, and I don't know how long it takes for her to get back, maybe the best would be that we can continue with Francisca's presentation. I think that would be the best.
Okay, let's try that. I'm not sure if Fan needs to unshare her screen.
Mm-hmm.
Or yeah. So welcome everybody. As Anna mentioned, I recently published a paper comparing scenarios, but also including some of our own scenarios. So I actually wanted to discuss that and a little bit from the European perspective. So my Zoom says I cannot share my screen as long as somebody else shares her screen. So what can we do? Can you maybe unshare her screen, Melis?
I'm actually trying
as admin?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Somebody writes in the chat, you have to remove her and then readmit her.
Sorry, I think I just, I was kicked out from the meeting for somehow, or my computer just didn't agree with what I just said.
Oh, Fan, are you back?
Hear me?
Are you back?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Because I was about to remove you, but I didn't kick you out. So I was about to do that. So because I wanted to share Francisca's screen. So can we continue with you? I cannot see. I cannot see your picture, but now I can see. Yeah, now I can see.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, well, yeah, glad to see you that you're back. So maybe we can continue where you stopped. So and yeah. So, and then we can move to Francisca. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Screen is yours.
Thank you. And let me know, feel free to interrupt if you don't hear me clearly. I was going to share some of my observations on COVID-19 and climate change. And with my, my expertise on mostly China energy and climate policy, and being in California for a couple of years working in the government to design California's climate policy, I do think the COVID-19 pandemic is really giving us a new window, both bringing challenges and opportunities for especially global collaboration to combat and adapt to climate change. I kind of categorize these challenges and opportunities in three bullet points. Momentum challenges that would really, the main challenge that is in the coming months, as we're already seeing the impact, is how do we sustain and recover the economy while addressing the pandemic threat. Also, in terms of investment, I think this COVID-19 brings us a fantastic opportunity to think about or rethink about the stimulus spending and how do we spend it in a green way that could actually have a positive impact on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And in terms of collaborative opportunities, that's a big topic that we've been discussing here. Of course, the pandemic has really, bring forward the importance for us to realize we should collaborate in this process instead of pointing fingers on each other about where the problem came from. And so from my perspective, I think the US and China, if they were able to collaborate and work together and solve those problems, that would be actually a very good opportunity for the whole world, and could also help other nations and other localities in terms of bring their economy back and address this threat. A little bit on China, I think we all agree that the need for government spending to stimulate the economy really presents as an opportunity to support the green economy. And so beyond the extrinsic benefits of a low carbon economy, I think there are many things that we should think about, such as how do we be better prepared for natural disaster that could foreseeable be brought by climate change. And also, how do we deal with air pollution, especially in places like California and big cities in China? That's always been a really major concern. In terms of China's COVID-19 and its recovery stimulus package, there are only a bit of information that could be shared at this moment. That's what I saw on the news. On April 17th, China's National Bureau of Statistics reported that the country's economy actually shrank about almost 7% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to a year ago. And so that might also be a trend in this year, as many nations and countries are facing this very tough situation. But reports also suggested that China will issue a big stimulus package to boost its economy, and which would include a spending about 2.8 trillion yuan. It's equivalent to about almost 400 billion US dollars in local government special bonds to spur infrastructure investment. The stimulus is actually expected to be considerably restrained vis-a-vis its 2008 stimulus package and also the US 2 trillion stimulus package. So I think government planners, especially who we're working with and talking to, are reportedly focusing on new infrastructure investment, which will include things like big data, 5G networks, but also green investment such as charging stations for EVs and a more ambitious plan to ramp up its renewable energy development. So that's just a few quick points I would like to share on COVID-19 and my observation of how China is reacting to the challenge and how they're taking this as an opportunity. I don't think we need to educate or talk too much with this group about carbon neutrality and where we are in terms of the projection under what IPCC pointed out under the 1.5 degree scenario. On the left side, it's basically the business as usual, and on the right side, the chart, as you can see, where...
Fan, can I interrupt you? Is it possible for you to share your screen? I think we're not seeing your screen, actually. We only see you. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was on that.
Yeah, sorry. We somehow it was unable, so...
Can you see that now? Let me know if you can't.
Yeah, all right, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll go back to the...
That's fine, you don't have to go back. We can also make it available later, but since you went to these figures, I think it would be helpful to see them. Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about it. I didn't know you guys didn't see the screen. So that's the two chart I would like to share. And again, I don't think we need to go into the details of those two charts. It's basically suggesting there is a significant gap that we need to fill to get to the 2050, especially under the 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide really shows where we are and how highly significantly insufficient of the current climate actions we are taking. And you can probably see where China and of course the US, unfortunately, are in this category of highly insufficient. It's just I think it's good context that to talk about where we are today and how we are adapting to the challenge, both in climate and pandemic. A little bit about California, which I've always been very proud of California's climate policy and its ambition to reduce its climate emissions. On this slide, it shows California's current carbon neutrality target, which through the executive order B55, it mandates that the state will actually achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 and maintain net negative emissions thereafter. And achieving these goals would complete a trend of other ambitious statewide targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can probably see on the chart, a suite of policies are already being put in place to make sure that California is on track to achieve its carbon neutrality target by 2045. And those policies primarily include carbon emission minimization measures, ZEF mandate, carbon trade program, and other policies that you probably are very familiar with. And also, as Anna also mentioned, carbon removal and sequestration solutions that we think would actually has a great potential to help state achieve its carbon neutrality goal in the next decades. So where is China? If we're talking about a carbon intensity goal, which China is already using, versus a under 1.5 degree scenario, a carbon neutrality target, that's a gap where the current policy projections where China is, and even under 2 degree scenario, there is a very significant gap that China needs to continue reducing its emission and taking more ambitious policies and measures to achieve that. So even we're not talking about 1.5, it's quite it's actually very insufficient given its policies right now. So moving on to the topic of zooming in energy sector, I think that's what we would like to focus today's discussion on. First, look at the projection of China's energy demand throughout 2050. And this is again data from IEJ, but there are many different models based on the data, but I think these gives us a pretty good overview. So given optimization and upgrading of the economic structure in China and the slowdown of its urbanization process, these will lead to a gradual slowdown in primary energy demand growth. So as you can tell from the bar chart here, from 2015 to 2020, the average annual growth rate will be about 2%, but the projection of the annual growth will go down to about 1.1% in 2020 through 2020 to 2035. And even after 2035, the growth rate will be negative. If these were true, primary energy demand will peak and plateau around 2035 and around 3.9 billion tons of equivalent. So that's the projection of China's energy demand at this moment. Looking into what are the energy sources, non-fossil fuel energy will have a faster growth and accounting for around 25% in 2030 and around 35% in 2050 respectively. So the proportion of coal will actually steadily decline as we hope, and dropping to about 42% in 2030, in 2035, and about further to 33 or even less by 2050. That's how the big picture of the energy demand. And taking a look at energy consumption, that's the other side of the pipeline. So energy-related CO2 emissions will actually, in its projection, will peak before 2030. And it's actually very consistent with China's current carbon emission peaking target. And then we are hoping to see a gradually decline back to 2050. And so carbon emission intensity, that's the target China is currently adopting, will hopefully decrease rapidly and drop by 62% and 82% from the level of 2016, even a little bit before that, to the 2035 and 2050 respectively. So by basically looking at the energy demand and consumption, I think it's fair to say that China's fossil fuel energy consumption will decline and carbon emission will reach a peak before 2030 or around 2030. And energy-related CO2 emissions of China would also continue to decrease, which will be about less than 20% by 2050. As we are hoping the peak of China's greenhouse gas emission, the CO2 emissions, will create a good opportunity for peaking of the global carbon emissions if the projection were to be proved by their policies and actions to be true. The change of China's emission will actually become very negative in the period between 2025 and 2030, which would also cause global emission to reach a peak after 2035. So that's where we are projecting the energy demand and consumption. Based on that, I think it's reasonable to believe and reasonable to consider that what China is pledging under Paris Agreement, which is to peak their greenhouse gas emission around 2030s. And so I think that's reasonable to believe the goal could be achieved given the projection and the policies they're making. In the more near term, I think that the larger question is, how does China achieve its near-term goal, which will make it more convincing for us to believe that China will be in a good projection to achieve its 2050 or even mid-century decarbonization target. Let's take a look at the achievement of the 5-year plan as we're talking about near-term target. I took out the renewable section from the 13th 5-year plan, which was implemented from 2016 to 2020, and which was adopted by China's National Energy Administration. So if you look at the from the bar chart and the table here, well, it's very obvious that the key objectives of the 13th 5-year plan in terms of renewable energy adoption have mostly been met, because they increased the share of non-fossil fuel energy in its primary energy consumption from 15% by 2020. So that gives us, in terms of different type of renewables, wind capacity, it's around 210 gigawatts, and renewable capacity as a whole, it's around 680 gigawatts by 2020. So that's where the China is in terms of the implementation of its 13th 5-year plan. And I think a lot of you know that China is in the process of making its 14th 5-year plan this year, and they need to finalize all the policies by early 2021. And most of those renewable targets will be enhanced. And we'll see how that will be implicated in the final plan, but the belief in the current argument is China would continue the track of a higher and enhanced ambition, in its renewable energy adoption and development policies. But also, I think it's quite obvious that renewable power curtailment will continue to be an issue if the grid modernization hasn't been resolved in China in the near term. Lastly, I just want to share a few quick points about the 14th five-year plan. I think from the very high level, President Xi Jinping said at the 19th National Congress meeting that to build an energy sector that is clean, low carbon, and safe, efficient for China, and the vision for ecological civilization, which will be reflected in its 14th five-year plan. So the main points already, it's in the leader's speech that they'll spend, there will be more enhanced and higher attention paid by the government on its higher level five-year plan planning, but also focus on subnational implementation of those targets. And sectorial side, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which is in charge of the overall climate policies in China, have already said that they're looking at an enhanced national target focused on carbon intensity, but would also have expecting provinces have consumption caps, which the same applies to other renewable development. My footnote here I wanted to share with all of you is, I think in the last year, and one concerning fact that is there might be which is also clear, the tendency of more coal power plants being built in China. That is really worrisome. And it's yet to be unfolded in its five-year plan, how China would adapt to the new normal, which is post-pandemic, how the country's economy recovery will look like, and how likely that the coal power plants could be transitioned to at least clean coal and eventually phase out coal by mid-century. That's still a hope that we have here, but yet to be proved by its policies, and a lot of research needs to be done to help China to get on that track. So with that, I will end here. Thank you again for your attention, and apologies for the technical problems we were having at the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fan. I appreciate your comprehensive overview of China. You already have one question in Q&A section, so you can answer that by writing. If you have time, we can also come back to that in general discussion. But without further ado, I will give now screen to Franziska. You can discuss sort of European, German, I guess, Norwegian perspective as you wish. So please.
Thank you, Melis, and thank you for inviting me here. Let me try to share my screen. Hopefully it doesn't let me drop out then. Germany doesn't have good internet connection, so you never know.
You can see it, and you can just do the slideshow, and it will be fine. Yeah, now it's perfect.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. So as Anna mentioned earlier, I've also sort of taken a meta perspective in my research in the past year. So I will also take a meta perspective here, I guess, but still highlight a little bit what are the important points for Europe. I also wanted to start with mentioning that actually Shell was one of the first institutions to start with these scenarios. And Pierre Weck, the person doing that at Shell, had a quote that I like very much, which is scenarios structure the future into predetermined and uncertain elements. The foundation of decision scenarios lies in exploration and expansion of the predetermined elements, events already in the pipeline whose consequences have yet to unfold, interdependencies within the system, and surprises often arise from interconnectedness, breaks and trends, or the impossible. So with this, I actually wanted to sort of put a little warning. You can't expect from me that I will tell you what will the future in European energy be, but I rather want to sort of guide you through what are the uncertain elements and what are the complexities that we have to look at. in the paper that we published earlier this year, we actually compared quite a number of global scenarios, and these here are the Europe numbers of these global scenarios. So these are not European scenarios per se, but global scenarios. And we had structured these scenarios by their carbon intensity. The green ones are those that have relatively low or the lowest CO2 emissions by 2050 compared to the other ones, and the red ones are the ones with the highest CO2 emissions. I'm not sure, can you see my arrow if I like sort of try to, cool, okay. So
yes, we do, yeah.
You have the scale here, here on the side. I depicted those elements that we could actually get out of the different outlooks, because there's not that much documentation in most outlooks. For the European Union, which are total primary energy demand, total coal demand, always from 2010 to 2050 or so, and also electricity generation. And what you can see is there's a lot of variety, right? I mean, I won't go into much detail, so that's obviously the sort of first impression that you have. The scenarios go all over the place. The only one where it's sort of a common trend is with coal demand, where we have a downward trend altogether between all scenarios. But some of the, or many actually, of the sort of, we dubbed them worst case scenarios. So the high CO2 intensity scenarios have still a substantial share of coal in the energy system forecasted to 2050, while the green ones, the low emission scenarios, really have many of them a complete phase out foreseen for the EU. So that's probably something that we really need to, or can see by now as a sort of an undisputed trend, a downward trend of coal, let's say, and even a coal exit. On the other hand, if you look at primary energy demand or electricity generation, that's much less clear. And scenarios can be more or less climate friendly. Scenarios can include a higher or bigger role of electrification of demand, and also a higher or bigger role of energy efficiency. You see that some scenarios actually foresee a pretty strong decrease of primary energy demand over time. Which is probably opposed as to what many people think, but this is really sort of the effect of conservation, of energy efficiency. In particular, for some of the green scenarios, this would then help achieving climate targets. So, but really a big diversity in what we can expect for Europe, and we don't really have a clear picture. The alternative way that people think about scenarios for Europe is not global scenarios zooming in, but rather the European scenarios being developed by European institutions such as the European Commission, or the European Commission also pays a lot of researchers to do research projects in their Horizon 2020 funding scheme to develop new scenarios. Many of the scenarios are just for the electricity sector, but more recent ones, like these ones here, are for the energy system, for industry, etc., all of energy demand as a whole. This is from the SETNAV project, which is a project that DIW also participated in, and we developed 4 pathways specifically for Europe. So not really taking into account what happens in the world, but really focusing on the European perspective. And we sort of identified 2 or 3 main structuring dimensions that were sort of the scenarios may differ quite substantially on a trajectory to 2050. This is the level of centralization between member states in the European Union, or in member states and in energy systems. So either a more decentralized system where, say, decentral electricity generation solutions, for example, but not only, for example, have a large role. It's also, it could also be a more decentral perspective to energy supply in terms of which utilities or what type of energy companies are actually providing your energy services. The other structuring element is the level of cooperation between member states. So rather a nationalistic policies versus a strong level of cooperation. And then the last one is path dependency. So do we continue with the energy systems we've had for the past decades, or are we really in a more innovative pathway, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of business models, in terms of policies allowing for grassroots developments, etc. And we sort of did a combination of what Anna mentioned between scenario planning and modeling. So we also modeled all that, and with a variety of models, because it also includes transportation sector, industry, the gas sector. But probably the most interesting and sort of the core numbers of what the electricity mix, or the power mix in the different pathways up to 2050. And here you can really see the difference that those three structuring elements, the path dependency, decentralization, and the cooperation, give as input, give for the different pathways. So you see, for example, the really big role of renewables, in particular wind, in the diversification, but also in the localization scenarios. So those are scenarios that really build on innovative. The pops up, sorry, on innovative technologies and decentral electricity generation. So it's not just wind; it's also other renewables. So you have solar just underneath. You have the complete opposite in the national champion scenario, which is a scenario that is sort of internalizing the big role for incumbent utilities and incumbent technologies. So have a huge role for nuclear, for example, in that scenario, but also still a relatively big role for fossil fuels. And the directed vision is sort of the fourth pathway in that set, which has a mixture of technologies and sort of a centralized push to decrease emissions, which is here actually a strong push also to decrease energy demand. So those three structuring elements are certainly sort of some that we can take to when we discuss EU scenarios. And I wanted to take the perspective of really people that work with scenario planning and foresight to discuss what are the different characteristics and sort of structuring elements of EU scenarios. I mentioned a few in the on the past slides, but usually when we start with doing scenario planning, we start by looking at or making us aware of what are actually our key assumptions, sort of the truisms, which are automatically the boundaries to the system, those that we actually usually don't challenge, that we think they will realize in any scenario, in all scenarios. And for EU scenarios, that I think, at least until very recently with the Corona crisis, but probably still today, those are elements like we assume that the functioning EU will continue to be there, and functioning multi-level governance and in the EU and the EU member states, with sort of respecting legal commitments. Also, in terms of more looking at the energy sector, functioning energy and electricity systems, and also electricity and other energy markets. So no disruption to those systems, and that I think was underlying all the scenarios, for example, that we saw in the first presentation. And what we see for the EU scenario specifically, as opposed to other world region scenarios, are that in particular for those that are sort of done for or with the European Commission, there is always a predetermined assumption that's not challenged, that there is a firm commitment to the Paris Agreement. And I think that's sort of important to keep that in mind, even though it's often not spelled out. And then looking at the key drivers, so those critical factors that actually change the system and that make us move into one or the other direction and onto one or the other pathway. The typical ones that we look at are a mixture of policy and technology. So it's, for example, the degree of cooperation between EU member states, as now set enough pathways. It's also the public opinion and then the sort of political implementation towards climate change and climate policy. And that probably is one aspect of that is any emission trading scheme. So we currently have the EU ETS, but you could think of enlarging that, and many scenarios that are very low emission scenarios, for example, enlarge the EU ETS and take strong assumptions about a CO2 price development that would go very well beyond the current legal commitments. So those are drivers that you find very often in the scenarios today. We should probably think about other drivers a little more in detail, such as the financial situation of energy utilities, and that's coming up a lot these days, obviously, both in terms of revenues, but also in terms of credit availability for both supporting innovative projects, but also just supporting sort of regular projects of maintaining capacities, etc. So that goes hand in hand with what's the support for innovation, both by governments, but also by companies, and what's the availability of technology. And I mentioned that this is really a big driver in all of the scenarios. Is CCS available in Europe? We talk a lot about power to X, power to gas, power to hydrogen. Both the availability, but also the costs of those are often very important drivers. And more there's an understanding that we also need to think about the demand side. So what are, for example, what's the availability of electric applications, say in industry like electric steel, but also in transportation, not just electric vehicles, passengers transportation, but also in freight transportation or in public transportation. So those are really drivers that can vary or make those scenarios vary a bit. And what also comes sort of in the same line is funding conditions for not just for utilities, but also for say for project developers, but for the government, etc. Can make scenarios or trajectories take different directions. And I wanted to have a look very quickly at a graph from a very recent paper by some colleagues here from Berlin and Zurich that have looked at what are actually the overall broad funding conditions for the energy sector and for the energy transition. And in the first panel A, you see the carbon price, and we've seen in the past weeks a very strong decrease of our EU ETS price down to levels prior to the reform in 2018. And now the question is, of course, will we for a long time stay down at those levels where people said, well, it's not providing a sufficient incentive for innovation and for introducing more low carbon technologies into the energy systems. So that's really a big it's a big driver, and it's a big unknown at the moment. Interest rates are probably not that much of a topic in Europe, but we've seen invariably very low interest rates. So the European interest rate is actually the one on the zero line here. There's hardly anything that monetary policy can still do for our funding conditions. And the other last point, which is of course more affecting the not the renewable side of the energy system, but rather the fossil side, are global oil prices. And you've all heard that we've seen a really stunning decrease of oil prices down to the level around $20 per barrel, and it's slightly higher now, but it's really just slightly higher now, which has started and pushed fossil energy companies, oil companies, gas companies to ask for financial support from governments, which is, let's say, a new trend that was probably not in most scenarios. And we've already seen for several years for the other fossil fuel sector, the coal sector, a relatively sizable deterioration of funding conditions, with more and more financial institutions restricting funding of coal projects, be it coal mining, be it coal-fired power plants, or just also mergers and acquisitions in the coal sector, which is a big thing in some parts of the world. So we see more and more multilateral agencies, but also, and that's a little more recently, asset managers, so funds that basically refuse to fund coal projects, and that was a long-term trend. And this may, the Corona crisis may actually bring us to reinforce that trend. in terms of our foresight terminology, the corona crisis definitely was something that some call a black swan. So an unexpected surprise that very few analysts have seen coming. Probably no analysts really did, at least not in the energy and climate community. When we developed our own scenarios, we did an expert workshop where black swans were also asked to be noted down by the participants, and there was one that said, well, maybe a pandemic from fossil fuel use, from cancer pandemic from fossil fuel use. So that came closest, but we discarded it in our scenarios because we found it so unlikely. Other ones that I looked back actually at what we did back in the workshop when preparing these slides was other black swans were a tsunami in the Mediterranean, not climate change induced, but just let's say weather-wise. So what would that do to our solidarity and cohesion in the European Union, or even a dissolution of the EU, which is something I said in the beginning as a sort of a key assumption right now, that we assume a functioning EU. And the last sort of characteristic or last element from scenario planning that I think is very important, and that we as analysts in particular need to emphasize more, are indicators. So indicators in our language are basically early warning signals that tell those that use and read the scenarios on which trajectory are we on, which pathway are we actually heading to. So that could be something like what's the share of fossil infrastructure use or fossil energy generation right now, or something like what's the cost level of renewable energies, because only above a certain threshold level could renewable energies play a large role in the energy system. Could also be something like which say support legislation, for example, for renewable energies is in place. That's something that the EU tries to use. So those indicators, I think, should play an even bigger role in using our scenarios. So to conclude, I think I wanted to sort of make that statement that I think the current crisis is very disruptive, and it can even challenge some of the truisms that we've always seen as not in question. So it could be the EU cohesion. We've heard that several times in the last weeks, that well, there's no unified agreement among member states on a lot of measures. It could also be, in the worst case, the commitment to climate policy and climate neutrality, not just in the EU, but also in other regions of the world. Yet, my impression is it's still unclear whether that crisis is a temporary shock or really a lasting change of trajectory, and we need to see that. So we've seen those differences in renewable shares in the electricity mix. We have seen that power generation from coal, for example, has decreased a lot compared to previous years and months. We've also seen, of course, that the oil use has decreased a lot, with a decreased particular passenger transportation demand. So, but is all that lasting, or is it just 2 or 3 months? That still remains to be seen. And I think there is a real big risk of falling in, I call that a trap, of supporting fossil industries. Some countries will definitely fall into that trap, in North America, for example, but also in China, as far as I understand it, which tries to boost the economic recovery with building even more coal-fired power plants. And I think it's good that the EU signals, well, we are more in favor of a green recovery project, but now we need to see what that means exactly. In general, when we look at our scenarios, there's a really big focus on technologies. And I think the current crisis is a moment to think about that we should increase the perspective of societies in our scenarios. So the role that societal change, that behavioral change, like we've seen in the last weeks, but also grassroots movements and other really societal drivers and changes could play for modifying our energy systems. That is something that needs to be put more into into our scenarios. And in the special issue or in the symposium that our paper in EP was published in, there's also a paper that actually discusses that, that role of technologies versus behavioral change. And for us as analysts, I think what's important is that we need to work more with those early warning signals, with those indicators of the different scenarios to make clear, well, we are on a trajectory that may not be wanted by politicians and other, but also other decision makers and companies, of course, if they think about their long-term goals. And then, of course, black swans, that's a big question that we probably need to discuss more, at least as analysts, and probably taking into account more non-energy and non-energy and climate elements into our scenarios as something that we need to learn. So thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thanks so much, Franziska. So we have about 15 minutes or so before we have to conclude, but I would give now opportunity to Nicholas to offer sort of political economy perspective, and I'm really sorry, I hope that you can do it relatively briefly.
I'll do my best. I mean,
no pressure at all. So
yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any slides because one, the topic's a bit more abstract and I didn't have much time. But basically, I think rather than trying to talk about how to forecast political economy conditions going forward, it's more a matter of actually unpacking what's happening now and its impacts now, and going back to what you were saying about the kind of early indicators or warning signals. So obviously my background is more in hydrocarbons, so oil and gas in particular, so I probably will focus mostly on that with some reference to coal and also the impacts that changing relative cost levels have for things like renewables. But first, I would start by talking about how the current crisis also raises like a lot of questions about the systemic impacts on the energy sector globally, like at the global level. So first, from a political economy perspective, I would bring up the issue of petrodollars. So, recycling a petrodollar is actually, in other words, the dollars that are accumulated because oil is sold in dollars primarily, became less prominent already due to the rise of US shale. But this specific price crash has really decimated highly leveraged firms in the United States in particular. And it's really not clear what shale's recovery is going to look like. But overall, if oil prices remain lower, which I think they probably will just due to technical innovations. So for example, offshore costs and unconventional costs have declined structurally, such that it's hard to imagine oil really being worth much more than about $60 a barrel, I would say, for very long periods of time, just based on the technology that's available and techniques available. It's going to be harder and harder for exporters to rely on their earnings, for their balance of payments. I'm thinking primarily of countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia, and this then interacts with the issue of peak oil demand. Now, if you just look at the capital structure of upstream projects in the oil sector, for example, as much as 80% of the capital spend is actually going into maintaining production. So the second you no longer have demand growth, the entire financial logic of the sector falls apart. And that's something that we're really seeing is clearly on the mind of clients in the private sector and in the way that companies are responding to the current price crash. I think there's really been a shift amongst the biggest oil companies that are privately owned globally about how much more they can rely on demand growth in a way that actually I think is outpacing some of the more conservative estimates that even research consultancies or academics might actually have. Now, this also is important to note because there's really no evidence so far that there's going to be a coordination of post-COVID economic policies for recovery. So there really is no longer a kind of off-ramp from this crisis the way that we had after the financial crisis, where different actors had discrete roles globally in terms of the role they took in managing an economic recovery, in the case of China, Germany, United States in particular. And what that really means is that whatever recovery looks like, it's probably going to be long and painful. And it's going to raise a lot of questions about trade and monetary policy in a way the last crisis didn't really. And the last kind of aspect of that problem for oil prices is the fact that the trade system has been falling apart the last couple of years. In particular, I'm thinking about the United States trade war with China, as well as kind of growing evidence that there's more and more pressure against really leaning on the WTO in the United States. And what that's also going to contribute to after COVID is probably going to be a relocation of supply chains, whether that be taking supply chains out of China or just generally trying to localize or regionalize production, which is going to likely have a kind of downward pressure on bunker fuels and shipping firms' demand. And it's also going to really I think, draw out a lot more at the national level in terms of national level energy strategies. And that's when you go from the international level to the national level, right? So exporting countries that are oil dependent or gas dependent are going to face declining rents. And that's going to kind of create a systemic crisis for many of them. Now, in the case of a country like Saudi Arabia or Russia, what that really means is that they're going to have to raise taxes on other things. Now, the problem then is that increasing tax burdens essentially suppresses domestic demand. So they're going to increasingly be economically fragile, and that's going to be a political problem going forward. I would argue that importers are probably going to gain market power, particularly if they significantly improve their energy efficiency, substitute fuels for cars, and use more public transit, and also kind of have a discrete and coherent plan for how to transition away from coal to natural gas, and then off of natural gas to green energy. It's an open question as to whether or not countries can kind of figure out how to become like green exporters. Obviously, China's dominant role in solar supply chains is an example, but that's also, it also is an area where policy fights are currently developing, I would say. So there's not much clarity on how reliably we can assume conditions are going to be the same or predictable. Then you have the kind of corporate level impacts. So for example, I would argue that national oil companies or national energy firms in general are actually much better positioned simply because they have more lobbying power and they do not have to be as profitable in an environment where the market is incredibly unpredictable and price swings are likely to be more normalized. And I would say prices, at least for oil and gas, will be more volatile. International companies are definitely stuck trying to transition towards net zero policies and away from being quote unquote big oil to big energy, but it's really unclear how that's possible, in part because the renewable space, for example, is much more heterogeneous. There are many more smaller players, there's a lot more competition, and it's also much more dependent on local and national level conditions and policies. And then finally, you have the question of investor impact and the fact that COVID has probably altered somewhat investors' risk appetites. Now, when oil prices drop below roughly, let's say $35 a barrel, a lot of renewables investment yields actually become similar to oil and gas investments for investors, simply because they're more stable over a longer period of time and you don't have to worry about asset devaluations when the price collapses. And so for that reason, I would say that right now in this current environment, there's definitely a lot more interest if you're an investor who's just dealt with a massive valuation loss in the long-term return. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's capacity to invest into, but in the longer term, I think that dynamic is really important to watch in the private sector, basically. Like, to what extent are investors willing to accept the high risk on the margins for upstream projects in particular versus renewables, because infrastructure is a different investment stock kind of class by nature. And so then I guess finally, like to wrap up those questions or those things we're bringing together, I think the biggest question we're facing is really how can demand bounce back for traditional dirtier energy, and I think that's actually the most important place to start if we're going to look at what policies are going to look like going forward. And I don't really know. One of the things I think is interesting about the current environment is that in the last 20 years, monetary policy has actually already had a massive impact on the hydrocarbons market, and particularly for oil. So in the case of the 2000s, the actual price rally and price boom in the 2000s before the financial crisis was driven largely by lowered interest rates in the United States and also then in the Eurozone. And the fact that then investors sought to borrow cheaply and then reinvest into emerging markets. And that leads to a kind of growing gap between expected supply and expected demand. Of course, after the financial crisis, when interest rates declined to near zero or zero in many cases, it means that capital can be allocated really inefficiently. So ironically, shale really only explodes because it's really cheap to borrow. And so there was actually a supply glut in part because of the US federal interest rate. And we saw that kind of collapse in 2015 when junk debt went under in Texas. And so lots of shale firms went under during the last price crash. They became more resilient, but the same problem is there, such that shale firms simply don't generate enough cash flow to justify the money they've received, but because of how cheap it is to borrow, they can keep operating. And so that dynamic works both ways because that same argument can be made for renewables. So I think what's interesting now about the monetary policy environment is that, ironically, it's actually already done the damage, if you will, on the oil side. And so now the question is can that environment benefit renewables more now that demand has been kind of artificially destroyed by health responses to COVID, and frankly, I think structural changes in the global economy. So to add on to that, since 2015, we've already seen evidence that before the current crisis, emerging market growth was slowing. So the biggest structural driver of increased oil demand in particular, and coal demand as well, was already kind of reaching a saturation point where the ability to invest cheaply was no longer generating the same returns in emerging markets. I think it's also interesting to note that before COVID really became the global story, there was already evidence that we were on our way towards a financial crisis or a global recession of some kind. Now, we can debate the causes of it. I think that I would trace it back to mid-September last year when the Federal Reserve basically decided that it would intervene in repo markets to the tune of roughly $80 billion a week because they weren't functioning properly. Obviously, that's a terrible signal. And every single time any economic bad news came out between, let's say, September and mid-January, the market would panic. The Fed would say something to calm it down, and it would just return its upward march. So I think that what's interesting also is that COVID is really not the only problem. There actually were other problems that were going into it that were negatively affecting demand and the ability for demand to grow. And I think that's finally, in the current crisis, really important to note, because emerging markets increasingly rely on kind of trade within the global south. In other words, exports between developing countries or emerging markets, not just exports to OECD countries. And so the current capital outflows from emerging markets because of the financial crisis that COVID's generated dwarf anything that happened in the last financial crisis. We have no scope yet or any good means of really modeling what the recovery looks like for emerging markets. And ultimately, they're the ones driving oil demand growth and coal demand growth. So long story short, obviously I've had to cover a lot of ground and simplify somewhat what I wanted to say. My argument about political economy here kind of really being a relevant starting point is simply that we don't really see any chance to change monetary policy, and it's clearly shaped a lot of the structural constraints and also possibilities for the energy market the last 20 years. I don't think anybody is going to propose raising interest rates because nobody wants to put people out of their homes. And obviously no government gets reelected if it does that. So assuming that's the case, what's interesting is states can cheaply borrow, though it's unclear if that's actually, if they can effectively spend. Companies can cheaply borrow. And that also means then that if investor expectations turn against oil and gas and coal more and more, you're probably going to see more willingness amongst investors to take risks when it comes to green energy and kind of frontier tech, just because they can afford to leverage themselves. And finally, I don't think that there's really any evidence that demand growth will continue on a kind of prior trajectory just based on real wages. The fact is that real wages were stagnant before in developed countries, and if they're rising in emerging markets, that was largely export-led. And simply put, as supply chains increasingly localize and regionalize, as capital is sucked out of emerging markets, and as we kind of deal with the devastation to jobs in the job market in developed countries, I just don't think that wages are going to be strong enough to actually sustain the type of growth we're used to seeing. So I don't have a date. I would not claim to have a specific kind of discrete arc, but I do think that the timeline for peak demand for hydrocarbons has accelerated significantly just because of the underlying macroeconomic conditions for consumers. And obviously, plastics aren't going anywhere. Some things are going to remain, reliant on petrochemicals and so on. But I do think that fundamentally, if you just look at the way that energy companies are talking, they're panicked in a way that I've never seen before. And that has to be taken seriously, I think, as a leading indicator that kind of prior models probably have to be adjusted to a new reality.
All right, thanks so much. I mean, that's very intense political economy there, Nicholas. Awesome, thanks so much. I'm really sorry, but we have to end here because we promised to finish it at 7:30, and exactly this is the time. I don't want to fail as a moderator. But I would like to thank everybody who listened to us, and we had a really strong response rate, close to 80% on our completely unscientific survey or poll. And it turns out that 13% of our participants didn't expect the coronavirus crisis to happen. So it's not maybe as black swan event as we sort of think it is. And in addition, Anna mentioned some of the scenarios from FEMA and others that were talking about potential pandemics and so on. And if you look at some other questions, we see that our participants are exactly split. 29 and 29% think that ambitious climate policy is more likely and is less likely. And the most people answered that it depends, 49%. And then which energy scenario would be most likely in the long run? 50% policy-driven scenario, but technology-driven scenario was also relatively close. Which global energy scenario would be least likely in the long run? Well, there is a pessimistic and wild card scenario, both get 26%. And which global energy scenario would be ideal in the long run? The answer was that it would be technology-driven scenario, 53%, and others got much less. And will China be able to keep its carbon emissions within targets pledged under the Paris Climate Agreement? 42% said no, 39% were not sure, and 18% said yes. So those were some of the inputs from our audience. And I'm sorry that we couldn't have a more discussion today. However, we're going to have 2 more energy webinars. This Thursday, we'll have energy webinar in Estonian with some of the professors from the Tallinn University of Technology and also EU Commissioner Kadri Simson. And next week, we are going to have also policy webinar with 2 members of parliament, with Anna and Einari Kisel from the World Energy Council in Estonian, so where we can discuss more the policy implications. But I appreciate everybody joining us today, giving input and giving this sort of really comprehensive overview, some of the developments and some of the potential trajectories in the world. So thanks again. Everybody here in Tallinn, have a good evening. People in the US, I guess, have a good morning. Or Anna, maybe good afternoon to you. Have a good afternoon. Have a good morning in California. Francisca, good evening. Nicholas, I guess it's almost evening in London as well. So yeah, and I hope to see you around. Thanks again and all the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.